Excellent. There we go. Well, thank you guys for agreeing to this. I think May and we did talk about when the first book of Queer Saints came out. We did talk about doing a kind of roundtable kind of discussion, didn't we?
Yes.
And then stuff, real life, it happens. It gets in the way, and it didn't happen, unfortunately. But since I can't believe how it's gambled, how it's just gathered so much impetus. It's kind of crazy.
Yeah, I was shocked by it as well, because I feel that when you're doing any kind of anthology, especially like it was my first anthology, I didn't have any kind of small press set up. I was just like, hey, I'm gonna make a book, and it turned into something much bigger than I could have ever anticipated, and it's been great.
Yeah, I mean, just looking at the reactions has been bizarre, quite frankly. Actually being a part of it, as all of us here are, and seeing people's reactions has been wonderful. It's been absolutely wonderful. I haven't seen, I kind of anticipated that there would be. I haven't seen much in the way of negative blowback at all.
No, not really. I mean, I think every now and then I get a little something. But it's usually just a troll on Twitter.
And of course.
It's someone who is so obviously a troll that Twitter blocks their comments from me even seeing it. So.
Oh, Vivian's having trouble hearing us apparently. Everyone else okay? Yeah.
Fix it, I think. Can you hear me now?
Excellent. Yes. Can you hear now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Excellent. Wonderful. Good.
Vivian, can you say something again?
Something again?
Yes. Okay, I can hear you.
Brilliant. Okie dokie. But yeah, I mean, I remember seeing the call for it for the first Queer Saints and your sort of manifesto for it and thinking, oh, God, yes. Yeah, normally I try not to get too invested in submission calls because, the odds on you're not going to make it. It's just one of those things, right? You sort of avoid disappointment in that way. But I remember wanting to be part of that one and getting, when you whittled it down to the last, what was it? It was like the last 20 and then the last 15. And I was like, oh, God, this is actually getting quite tense now. I actually really, 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 really am invested.
Yeah, it's always it's difficult because with the first Queer Saints, I think we only had 125 submissions, which I mean I know it's pretty good for a very specific kind of call.
Yeah.
But so we had 3 featured authors, so that's 3 spots already taken. So there were only 10 slots left for folks. And yeah, you were one of those folks, and I'm very happy that you were a part of it.
No, it came at a good time. I could tell you, it was such a pick me up to be involved in that project, because it was, having read the manifesto, it was something that I'd been seeing quite a lot in literary circles, certainly in genre fiction. There was this. And it's still happening now. There is this strange sort of internal censoriousness arising from within our own communities, which I find really distressing. This notion that queer people and queer creators cannot explore the fullness of their humanity in all of its variation, whether it's considered to be positive or negative or whatever, without it becoming what people term negative representation or what. Yeah, I find that so limiting.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things that's really shocking to me is that there are all kinds of extreme examples of horror films and horror literature that feature straight folks, and that it has nothing to do really with their sexuality, or it's a lot of horror is very psychosexual and sexually charged,
of course,
but there's no kind of I won't say that there's no pushback, because lots of people push back against horror in general, but I feel like when the stories feature queer folks, a lot of the pushback has to do with the queer identity itself, and not so much the horror elements or the like the disgusting, gory like elements. Like they focus more on the queer stuff, whereas when it's featuring straight folks, it's more on the content, and you have to really ask yourself why that is.
Why is that exactly? Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? The fact of, like, as you say, that division when you have what is generally considered to be heteronormative, sort of straight-centered horror, if you like, that those identities very rarely become a question at all, except in the most sublimated way. But the fact that queer horror gets that pushback, it seems to be happening quite a lot in genre fiction. I mean, I don't know whether you guys are familiar with what's happening in pulp science fiction at the moment, where you have this, again, like in horror, like in fantasy, there is this incredible efflorescence of new voices, basically, from all sorts of marginalized demographics who have been traditionally kind of ostracized or ghettoized within the genre. But there seems to be this incredible pushback from the more conservative quarters of those genres, and it from what I can see, it seems to be stronger for some reason in science fiction than it is in horror.
Really?
I have no idea why that would be, but there seems to be more of a concerted effort to sort of close the gates, and man the walls of science fiction.
Well, and I'm saying this as a big science fiction fan. I really think there's always been something a little more conservative about sci-fi than about other genre fiction.
Mm-hmm.
I wish I had come up with this. I'm reading someone saying the thing about sci-fi is that sci-fi authors are always willing to look at trends in the future, shit themselves in terror, and go running back to the safety of a new dark age.
That's brilliant. Yeah, so there's a conservatism inherent almost, certainly in sort of the pulp sci-fi.
I blame Campbell.
I think a lot of people do. But no, I find that fascinating. I mean, how have you guys found it as being involved in horror circles? How have you guys found it as queer identifying people?
I'm waiting for Davis. Davis looks like he's thinking.
I was going to say that I started writing about 2 years ago, or now 3, because it was I think 2020 was when I started, and
good year to start.
Yes, it was the perfect time. I was totally not given a absurd amount of time alone to do that. But what I always found really fascinating about horror, in comparison to sci-fi, is that horror is often allowing for, in a way that science fiction is, when science fiction tends to go into the horror genre, it's usually about this fear of having gone too far scientifically, and that only so much progress can be allowed for humanity to survive.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, you begin to enter a territory that is far beyond what we are able to control, and thus brings about the destruction of humanity. And in that way, I think that science fiction ends up leaning a bit more conservatively.
Mm-hmm.
And whereas with horror, I always thought it was really interesting seeing the reactions to works that were coming out right around and right after the pandemic, which was, if I'm not mistaken, where a lot of the conversation around problematic queer persons in writing began to emerge. And it was this really interesting rise because we also had the emergence of TikTok and BookTok come in and coincide together, where you were getting these audiences that are new to the genre and are coming in with different sensibilities. All the while, there's an emergence of queer horror, and like very openly queer horror, as opposed to more of a Jennifer's Body type of
yeah.
Yes, where it's like present for like one line, but like then it disappears, and or just heavily coded. But it was, I think people were really reactionary to seeing queer people be displayed as villains and as monsters in a way that it was like three competing different ideologies, where like queer writers were exploring themselves being seen as heroes and as these very like, we just want to be existing in these stories type of narratives. While at the exact same time there was this emergence of stories about really messed up queer people. And this especially goes when you think about like all the works that were like going viral on TikTok at the time were usually works that were like ones that like people were trying, like would often describe as something that they had to put down because it was too scary or too gory for them. So it was really interesting watching audiences delve into horror and kind of bounce back as if it was like a massive experiment for them.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So coming out of like the pandemic as well, it's such a fascinating time, and one that we haven't really come to deal with in global or cultural terms at all. The trauma of that period is still rattling around our cultures and as individuals around our skulls as well. And I wonder if that has also fed into the reactions that we're seeing.
Yeah, it's possible. I think that I mean, there were all kinds of reports coming out at the beginning of the pandemic about book sales like soaring, you know, like they're like puzzle sales, like things that people can do at home. Like that was a big deal. And I think that opened people up to kind of a Pandora's box of, okay, like let's explore what is out there. And then they stumble upon something that, you know, because people who write extreme horror have a pretty niche audience.
Yes.
You know? And people who were not really part of that audience were discovering this. And of course, there's going to be pushback because they're not who this kind of material is really written for. But I think that, you know, at the same time, we have this sort of like clash of cozy kind of like romance, like usually it has to do with like a young teenage gay guy in high school, like meeting another young teenage gay guy in high school.
Yes, I know the kind of thing you mean. Yeah, definitely.
And it makes people all warm and fuzzy inside, and you know, it's not the kind of queer representation that I grew up with. Usually that stuff, it was like the stuff that I grew up with was much more John Waters, you know, like, like Jamie Babbitt, like, but I'm a cheerleader. Like that it's different, you know, than what a lot of like Gen Z kids are exposed to now. And I think it's understandable that there's sort of a culture clash between like their understanding of us, because I think most people who are writing extreme horror are like millennials or older, you know. I think that there's a distinct difference between the generations, and I think that feeds into this misunderstanding.
Now that is fascinating, like the generational difference. That's something that I've certainly noticed. I mean, I think, I may be absolutely wrong, so please correct me on this, guys, but I think we're all on this call old enough to remember a time when horror as a genre was just saturated by just straight white guys. That was pretty much it, primarily. There were a few exceptions. There were one or two outliers, but primarily they were the voices. They were the voices that we were
still
seeing.
Not very far from that.
No, we aren't. No, we definitely aren't. But I mean, I'm sure it's the same for you guys, but I remember coming across my first like queer horror story that featured queer characters, and it almost certainly was Clive Barker actually. It was probably one of the Books of Blood. It wouldn't surprise me if it was In the Hills, the Cities, to wax cliche.
Hard
And
saying.
like realizing, oh my God, we can do this. This is possible. We can actually talk about this. We can actually explore this in this genre. What it was it, and I remember the sensation being like almost like, I don't know, taking LSD or something. Doors of perception flying open inside my head. It had just never occurred to me, because I was very young, like way too young to be reading Barker. That's for damn sure. It had never occurred to me that you could explore being queer in a horror story, because that just didn't happen.
The first ever queer work that I ever read, and is a really funny thing whenever people like bring it up on Twitter, like, oh, what was the first thing that like you untook that was like had gay characters in it? And it's Stephen King's It. And
of course.
And usually every time I post that, like there's like several comments who are like, I am so sorry. So my first experience with queer characters in horror was not only an extreme horror situation, but it was also this it was like what you would expect of queer media at the time. But at the same time, I grew up with Glee and Modern Family. And so I was able to watch those characters, and you saw the beginning of these two different camps where you had Ryan Murphy's American Horror Story, and then you had Glee in the other section.
Right.
And there's no in between.
Yep.
And I don't think I saw like an actual true in between that was like able to collect from both audiences until Haunting of Hill House or Haunting of Bly Manor came around and introduced queerness to Gothic stories. And I always find it so fascinating looking at the type of media that gets adapted, specifically from literature, and how much of it is Heartstopper and type media, and how there's like a real hunger for that. And at the exact same time, we're seeing a real hunger for like these deep and not deep, these horror stories that are featuring queer characters who are monstrous and antagonistic and willing to do what is necessary for their own survival, and is such like a fun contrast to balance, because I didn't really have when I was growing up, it was either really like an HBO type representation of queerness, where it was entirely about the sex lives of these people and how their own flaws cause them to lose everyone around them, and you see them develop as people through very complicated issues, or a gay couple in a comedy.
Yeah. And like you said, no in between. Those were the two. It's almost like there are certain archetypes of queerness that are, or rather were, allowed within mainstream fiction, and it's those two poles, isn't it? It's the sort of sanitized, safe queer character who is okay, they're fine, and then there's the dangerous, corrosive queer character, and it's fascinating to see the onus of both of them shift up and down depending on what's going on within culture. So now we're getting the pushback against the representation of the sort of more complex, dangerous queer character from within queer communities. That's what really fascinates me more than anything. And I think that's primarily what the original Book of Queer Saints was reacting to, wasn't it, May? Is that correct?
Yeah, it was really, I mean, specifically, I've been really open about the fact that it was specifically inspired by what was going on with Eric LaRocca's Things Have Gotten Worse Since We Last Spoke. because someone found the book and it went viral on TikTok. And then there was a very brutal bullying campaign against Eric from other members of the queer community.
They
And
picked the wrong one there, I can tell you. Eric is, you don't mess. Eric's great.
it was very specifically the queer community coming up against Eric. And that was really, I don't know, it was difficult and uncomfortable to see, because I still to this day don't really understand why it was so, I don't know, why it went viral, why it was such a big deal, you know?
I did see some of the criticisms that were leveled against Eric, and by and large, I mean, I never saw a one that was in any way considered or in any way legitimate, but by and large, they seem to be coming from this perspective of negative representation. That seems to be what came up again and again and again and again. They were condemning Eric for providing a negative representation of queerness, which is utterly bizarre, because even, you know, having read Eric's work, which is great, by the way, it's just so good. It's not negative, it's kind of honest. There's a sincerity to it. Eric is using his work to explore his own concerns and his own issues, as authors and creators do. You can't stop people doing that. You know, that's what we're here for.
I think a lot of the pushback there too was from folks thinking, you know, it was from folks who identify as lesbians, who thought this is negative representation for lesbians specifically, and should this man, quote unquote, be
so it was
writing lesbian stories. And I think some of the pieces that get missing in the online discourse is, you know, first of all, we don't know everything about a person. We don't know how they identify or what they're struggling with, or you know, how important it might be to explore gender, other means of other types of relationships in their work, because I think for horror writers specifically, we're really exploring things within ourselves. I like, not across the board, but I think for me personally, that's how I write, is I'm exploring something about myself, and to try to limit that for queer folks specifically, where identity is so complicated. And it's a journey. You know, you don't know everything overnight. Sometimes it takes a really long time to get to a place where you really understand yourself and how you identify, and that might be fluid, and it might be like it might not ever land anywhere. You know.
Absolutely.
So I think that the criticism leveled against Eric, and the criticism leveled against a lot of folks who write queer horror, is very limiting, and is really attempting to put folks into boxes, and not allowing them the freedom of exploring themselves through fiction. And
there's a dehumanizing element to it, isn't there? There's a dehumanizing element where it's inadvertently, if you know, it's often inadvertent, but what they seem to be doing, those who are leveling criticism at queer horror writers, is they are attempting to limit our degree of self-expression and self-exploration with reference to fairly heteronormative assumptions. It's like there's an accommodationist element to it, which I find massively distasteful myself, because as you said earlier, May, it doesn't happen for straight or cisgender creators or writers. It just doesn't happen.
There we go. So I have, I think, two big thoughts on this. One, obviously, and this is something I thought is kind of focused on the trans experience, but I think also expands to the rest of the queer community. For those of us above a certain age, and that age is honestly entirely too young, we are all traumatized individuals held together by duct tape and baling wire. And so I think there is this tendency to when something approaches, those sensitive spots to lash out, and that's why we have. That's part of the reason we have these rounds of discourse that almost, I think, frequently amount to us not agreeing with one another hard enough.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing, and here's I'm just going to show my age here because I'm in my early 40s, and I apologize if this comes off as those damn kids these days.
Get off my lawn, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Exactly. There's an appalling drop in media literacy.
Yeah.
I've got this running joke I use every so often when I see things like this. This is what happens when you defund the humanities.
Yes, absolutely.
There's this tendency, and this really hurts those of us working in horror. If you write this, you mean it. Everything is didactic.
Yeah, and literal, right? Everything is literal.
Clearly, if I'm writing this character saying this, that must be what I, the writer, think. Especially if
it's a manifesto, right?
It's like, no, it's what the character thinks. I may agree with parts of it. I may think, you know what, you're being an asshole right now, but that's true to you, and that's necessary for the story.
Yep.
I know a lot. I think a lot of it's also a reaction to things like the Hays Code. Because I think if there's one thing that draws a lot of us specifically to queer horror, it's the fact that queer people had to be portrayed as villains, portrayed as monsters. And as a result, we're like, oh, okay. So what you're saying is that Medusa's hot.
Yes.
Absolutely, of course.
So, yeah, I think I lost my train of thought there. But, I think there's this inability these days to really approach more challenging, less literal material on its own merits and actually like dig into it and like, okay, so not even necessarily what the author's saying, because there's also, if there's what I think is the biggest sin of amateur criticism, and I've done it myself. This tendency for people with 0 hours of any kind of medical training to look at the work and then thus try to psychoanalyze the author.
Yes.
It's like maybe I'm not saying anything about this topic you're coming up. Maybe I didn't. It's possible I stumbled onto a landmine. It's possible I did make a mistake, and if that's the case, I need to. Or it's possible, no, I'm not saying anything about that. You're just bringing your own experiences, negative or positive, to that. But we really do need as readers and as writers, the freedom to explore those more horrific things, if only because it's fun.
Yeah, absolutely.
As a parent, I love Steven Universe. I'm glad it exists. I wish it had been there for me. I have no idea what sort of media landscape could have caused something like that to exist in the early 90s.
Yeah, tell me about it.
The thought of it.
Well, children's television exploring ideas that Steven Universe does in the 1990s. Wow.
It does not happen.
Just didn't happen. Certainly not in the UK. It didn't. I could tell you. My God.
The closest we've got is, the X-Men animated series being entirely about Charles and Magneto's breakup. These two homosexuals break up, and it's everyone else's problem for 60 years.
Isn't it the truth, though?
It's like, yeah, I'm really glad the kids these days have that. But there's a time where you also have to reach out for something more. And even there, when we're talking about, probably the coziest of children's media, there's an entire sequel series which is all about how, and after all of this, the main character has serious PTSD. So even then, it's not ever, completely unproblematic, for, I guess, lack of a better word. And I don't want to be like dismissive and say, there's a time where you have to grow up and start seeking more challenging media, but we're all going on when we ran into things. Much like Davis, much like you, my first exposure to a queer character in any media that I can think of probably was that first chapter of It.
Of It, yeah, which is, I mean,
At
it's
14.
problematic, isn't it? I mean, it's a problematic representation. It really is.
It is. I mean, I'm a constant reader.
Uh-huh.
I respect Stephen King a lot. I certainly went through that phase where I read every one of his books, which even in the mid-90s, that took forever.
I can imagine that's a huge back catalogue to get through.
And I respect what he was trying to do. I think he was deliberately, the horror of that is the homophobia.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, it's what's your representation? It's a victim.
Yeah.
I love the Sandman. I really love how in 24 Hours that the really awful issue, I say that with love, in the first arc of Sandman introduces a lesbian character, and even before she goes through everything, it's like, oh, by the way, the reason she's here and she's so upset is because she's abusive and her girlfriend left her.
Yeah.
I read that at 19. I'm like, how do I process this? And it's one thing when it's coming from, these are both works coming from cishet white men.
Yeah, of course.
So that puts a spin on it. Am I going to judge that harder than I would if it had come from, if instead a gay author wrote something about, this ancient monster, the ancient eating monster murdering a gay man, would I feel differently? If a lesbian had written the Sandman, would I feel differently? I've gone off on a tangent.
But no, I get exactly what you're saying. There is a problem. There is a real problem in just general literature. I've lost my train of thought now. That went well, didn't it? But no, in terms of literacy, just general literacy, there seems to be a significant problem, particularly with regards to criticism that occurs on the internet. That seems to be an enormous problem, whereby you have people who have platforms and therefore feel as though they have the means to provide criticism, and it doesn't always factor in. There's a particular kind of criticism that's evolved on the internet, it seems to me, which is little more than navel gazing. It's picking apart media and literature for tiny little incidental details rather than looking at wider interpretations and wider perspectives and significances. And that is pervasive on this platform. It's absolutely pervasive.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that, I would never want to discourage anyone from engaging with media critically, but I think that is really the key factor, is that the critical part, like that part is like the critical thinking part is absent, and it feels to me that it's like the first reaction someone has to something, it becomes the right way to engage with that media and the right way to view it. And people don't take a minute to think, what is this really about? And like you said, George, like the broader themes, and like, why would someone write this? Why is this important to them? Or like, what is it trying to say? If it's trying to say anything, does it exist for fiction's sake?
Yeah.
Which, a lot of the time it does. It's just written by a queer person and it has queer characters. It just happens to be extreme horror because that's the genre that this person is within. But I think that, people will take their initial reaction and run with it. And if you have a following on social media, it's extremely easy to get people really angry about something.
Oh, yeah. Oh, isn't it
so
just?
Easy. Especially if, like, I found myself in a few sticky situations myself where, if something makes me angry or upsets me, I'll tweet about it. And then people will start rallying behind me, and they get angry about it, and then it becomes something like really nasty and something that I didn't intend. But if you have a following, and if you have people who are quote unquote on your side, it's really easy to get them to kind of like rally behind you and then attack someone or something, or like a piece of media, whatever. It's really easy to do that, dangerously easy.
Yeah.
And it's not something that I ever intentionally do, but it has happened. And has been really upsetting for me to see that like my anger could spark so much anger and hate and vitriol towards someone or something. So with people who have massive followings, because I have a modest following, right? But if you are on TikTok and you have a massive following, just that situation that I've been in, multiply it exponentially.
Yeah.
And then target at one author who happens to be queer and happens to write extreme horror, it's a catastrophe. It's horrible. And that's what happened with Eric's book, and that's what inspired Queer Saints.
Fantastic. I mean, it's fantastic that it inspired something so good to come out of it, though, because I've seen not just as a result of the Book of Queer Saints, but generally speaking, there is this pushback coming from queer writers and queer artists now to that very phenomena, where there's entire projects occurring where we're saying no, we're not allowing for that. We need to be free to explore our fundamental humanity in all of its ambiguity, its contradictions, and everything that's negative about our identities too. That's part of who we are. That's part of our humanity. It's part of everyone's humanity. And we need to be free to do that for it to be sincere. If it's not, then if we can't do that, then it's kind of a lie, isn't it? We're putting on a mask. We're putting on a face for another audience, you know?
Yeah. I'm just not willing to do that.
No, nor me. I mean, I know when I wrote The Last Disgrace, one of the things I was really going for in that one is trying to explore some of the darker tensions that exist between older gay men and younger gay men. There is often, certainly here in the UK, there is there can be a predatory element to that. I've experienced it firsthand when I was a younger gay man, and now I'm an older gay man. I can see it happening from another perspective, you know, and that's kind of what I was trying to look at in as sincerely as I can, and that includes all of the darkness of that dynamic. It includes it, and it's part of it.
Yeah, but then if you write something like that, the risk is always that people think that you're a predator.
That you are absolutely right. That you are. That you are exploring something that you believe or that you think or that you feel, right?
Yeah.
Rather than exploring it as a phenomena. Oh, sorry, Davis, go on.
Oh no, I was just gonna say that like one thing that like I'm really happy about that's come out of TikTok in like the past couple of months or up to a year now is that have you guys ever heard of that meme where it's like, oh, the curtains are blue, that whole thing? There was like this Reddit or Tumblr post from a very long time ago that was about people being annoyed that English teachers were digging into why curtains were blue. And
like in a story.
Yes. And so the entire idea was maybe they're just blue and author had no intent. And so for a while, there was like this anti-analysis thought where it was taking art more literally. And there's this very interesting discussion on TikTok that came out about the curtains are blue in relation to this Picasso art gallery that arrived, where it was a comedian who was presenting on it was their stand-up video of her essentially going on about like the history of Picasso and his abuse of women, and alongside that was all of his art pieces without their context. And so there was this really great discussion about, did it invite you to ignore Picasso's artwork and go, oh, this was made by a bad person, and as a result, there's no value to what was made. And so, and as a result of like that, as well as like a bunch of like collective like people not going in and talking about artworks that like that like had like really like reactionary videos made about them. So more and more, there's been people attempting to advocate for more media literacy and digging into, why did this author decide to use this character? Like, why did they decide to say this one thing about this? Why are they using this word choice, even if like it doesn't seem like it's purposeful? Like, why, even subconsciously, is this author deciding to explore this topic, use these words to describe this person?
No, and it's good. The curtains are just blue.
But even that's worthy of discussion, right? Even if it's incidental, it's worthy of analysis. And it is worrying to me, that degree of literacy, especially when we're talking about genres like science fiction and horror and what's generally termed speculative fiction these days, which is by its very nature metaphorical. It requires analysis deeper than the literal in order to make sense, in order to have any kind of weight or significance.
Yes.
I just got reminded of this, like, because we were talking about representation across like all genres, and I think it's really interesting to see more queerness be represented in genres where we didn't see queerness get growing up. Like, for example, it wasn't until Strange Worlds, that Disney movie that came out like last year, that I saw a gay character in animation. Or actually, no, Kipo and the Age of the Wonder Beasts.
Yeah.
First time I ever saw a queer man in animation. And so I was just fascinated by the fact that, like, for this very, very long time, it was queer women being represented in animation. And the same goes for how you often see queer women more in genre spaces in science fiction and horror and fantasy. And the same goes for like a lot of the books that have gotten popular and press.
Yeah, but there's often a sexual element to that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
definitely.
And, you know, generally if it's written by men who are straight and cis, that's why.
Yeah.
And it's like, and I found it so fascinating that, like, on the complete flip side, queer men are usually represented in contemporary works that are either dramas, comedies, or the teen romances that we've been seeing a lot of, where it's usually a nerdy, depressed, or anxious, you can combine both, gay man with his Labrador Retriever bisexual jock boyfriend who is in his first relationship with a man. I don't know why that's the gold standard. I've been talking to my friend about it, who is super into fan fiction, and so I've been like, could you please explain like where this came from, because I'm so fascinated by like the popularity of the dynamic. So it's really cool to see queerness be represented in multiple genres.
Yeah.
For example, I've just been watching The Fall of the House of Usher and Castlevania Nocturne, and both of those are super queer.
Fantastic! Oh my god, Castlevania, the new one, Nocturne. It's so queer, isn't it? It's like, wow.
It's so interesting seeing varying degrees of queerness and be represented in genre fiction. When I was growing up, The only show that I knew of that was a genre fiction product that had queer characters in it was Lost Girl, I think. And then, for the most part, if I wanted to see a queer man in anything, it would have to be an HBO series or a family comedy where it's, one of those two. And so finally being able to see everyone be spread out and finally getting the representation they need is, I think it's one of like those great, I guess what I'm attempting to say is that having much more representation across a variety of genres instead of just a select few of genres allows for us to expand what we can view as queerness in this type of story. So if you're writing queerness and extreme horror, I think eventually people will be able to become accustomed to seeing queerness represented in that genre and go, how does this look? How does extreme horror, queerness and extreme horror, how does that look in comparison to queerness in YA teen romance and graphic novels? And and essentially be able to go kind of like select like your own taste in like what you are wanting in media as opposed to having only like 3 options to choose from.
I suppose it also expands the scope of what is permissible as queer representation as well, doesn't it? Because, of course, as I think we've all discussed, certainly in the 1990s when we were growing up, the scope of that was incredibly narrow, to the point whereby early on it didn't even exist. I know here in the UK we had certain breakthrough shows and certain pieces of breakthrough media that hit with incredible force and brought queerness cascading into the mainstream. So in the mid to late 90s, we had Queer as Folk by Russell T Davies, which was it was a phenomenon. It was a cultural phenomenon. Really, up until that point, the only queer characters that we ever got were often in sort of evening soap operas, and they were one of 2 archetypes. They were either the sanitized gay person who was pretty stereotypical and almost cartoonishly so they were safe, they were sanitized, they operated with regards to certain like heteronormative prescriptions of what gay was. Or you had the self-hating, self-loathing, in denial queer character who ended up destroying everything around them and then quickly disappearing from the narrative. What Queer as Folk did was it obliterated all of that. It completely obliterated all of that. You had the show that portrayed the lives, the sex lives and the romantic lives and the domestic lives of gay men in the late 1990s UK in all of its aspects. So it was floridly sexual, this show, floridly sexual, but interestingly, no more so than many other shows of the era that were centered around heterosexual romances. And that was really the point. That really was the point. It was showing, well, look, this is not that big a deal. It's just gay guys having sex, as they do, as we do. It's just that. I remember there was a great interview with the show writer Russell T Davies where he showed some of the more overt sex scenes from the show to an audience, and to some of the acts there were some sort of hissed intakes of breath, and he paused the video and said, "Okay, how many of you have seen that scene in a show with a heterosexual couple?" All the hands went up. Okay. How many of you have done that with your girlfriend or your significant other? Or, loads of hands go up. It's like, well, yeah, there you are. And that's the effect that Queer as Folk had. It kind of it normalized us in terms of our representations on mainstream television. And it brought to audiences that, of course, this was pre-internet. This was largely the internet existed, but it was in its infancy back then. So access to queer media and queer communities was much harder for straight people back then, certainly here in the UK. So it was a way of breaking through into people's living rooms, if you like. It brought us into people's domestic lives in a way that had never really been seen before.
it brought gay sex into people's living rooms.
Oh yeah, it did. Oh yeah, it did.
Yeah.
It absolutely did.
Spill forth like as soon as like you're back from the club, just you barely ever make it to the bedroom anyways.
Oh man.
Speaking of like I find it really fascinating that like going back to TikTok because I've just been on that platform since 2020 and it's just been
I don't understand TikTok at all. Like I mean I have an account, but I'm not on there, you know?
I love it. I especially love following like academics on TikTok because they do like these really cool deep dives into like very specific topics. But one thing that like has been emerging, and this happens every single June on Twitter, and it's the No Kink at Pride discourse.
Oh my God, yes.
Oh, that happened. Yeah. I've seen that.
Yeah, it's so fascinating watching it
every June.
Specifically because so much of it is kind of exploring queerness as a history course. And so you have like all these queer academics come on and be like, oh, by the way, this is why we have this event. And what I think is also really fascinating is in relationship to genre is bringing yourself and going, am I when I visit this space that was maybe not catered to me, how does that in relation to myself like affect like for what you were able to choose and do? Like for example, when it comes to queerness and horror, there's when you pick up a book and you see that it is leaning towards extreme horror. Like, for example, Playground is one of those books that has gone viral on TikTok, and it is a very, very extreme horror novel. And so what I find so interesting is that in the same way that TikTok is able to cater an algorithm for people are now beginning to explore like what spaces they are wanting to find themselves in. And so there has been a much more positive effort, like Folsom Pride. Folsom just happened like 2 months ago, I think. But like that popped up on TikTok and there's a discourse around that. And it was really interesting because instead of it being like a very reactionary, like this should never happen, majority of the people were actually like, you can actually just not participate. Like that doesn't have to be your space, and that's okay. And so there was all these queer people going, oh, okay. So like, I can just like if it's not designed for me, then I just don't have to go.
Yeah.
Like
what a radical
you can
concept.
just close the book.
Exactly. Close the book, change the channel, don't play the video game, etc., etc. Right? What a radical concept that is.
Exactly, and it's so interesting too because it's really cool watching people discover new genres and materials through TikTok because of how viral they go, only to go, oh hey, this isn't for me, but maybe something. But I do like spooky stuff, so maybe I might like something. And I know like there's like this whole discussion around cozy horror, and I somehow managed to avoid most of that.
It's so dumb.
I think Midnight Society did the best commentary on cozy horror by just acknowledging that none of us know what the fuck it is.
Yeah.
I mean, the thing is that if cozy is going to mean different things to different people, and there's nothing fucking wrong with it. Just let it go. Just let people be cozy with horror. Just
let people read what they want and get what they want out of the material they want. What is the issue?
What I find fascinating about this now, honestly, like you were just talking about, Davis, is that like 10 or 15 years ago when I first, really started exploring, comics and other forms of fiction through the internet, as everyone was talking about how great it was now that finally we had this thing that let all of us who have these really weird and specific tastes find something that appealed to us,
Mhm.
because it's never going to be in Barnes and Noble.
Yeah.
For the simple reason that if there is one person in this town that's going to pick up this copy of the book, Barnes and Noble isn't going to carry it. And I understand
Mhm.
that. But now, you have the long tail discussion. You can find the 10,000 people in your audience across the world, across the whatever, and that's great. Everything doesn't have to be, packaged down to basic mass media glurge. And I mean, God bless you if airport novels is what you want. I'm not
Mhm.
here to judge anybody. Someone's reading them. They deserve to read what they want.
Absolutely.
And the rest of us, deserve to find our, weird, esoteric bullshit. And with that in mind, it just kind of floors me that we're going kind of back to this, as you were saying, but it's not for me. Cool. Move on and find something you like. We're in the most post-scarcity society ever in regards to information, entertainment,
Mhm.
like whatever you want, you're gonna find it.
Yep.
And frequently, as tools become more available in very high production values.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it's like, why be angry about it? Just put it down and move on with your life. We'll all move on with our lives. It's fine.
It used to be so hard to find queer media. Like,
Oh God, yeah.
I remember I would pirate a lot of stuff.
Mhm.
Like, like the UK Queer as Folk. I didn't have access to that in Arkansas in the early 2000s. So, and we didn't have internet at my house. I'd have to go over to my friend's house and use their computer to pirate Queer as Folk, and then I would have to sit at the desktop and watch it.
At a friend's computer, watching the UK Queer as Folk in all of its florid queerness. Great, I love that.
Yeah, I mean, it was so much harder, and I think it's the fact that we have the exposure to so much queer media now should be celebrated more than it is divisive.
Yeah.
Like I think not. Like Vivian said, not to go back to that, like those damn kids, they don't know, but they really don't know how difficult it was to find queer media, especially if that's really the only kind of media that you wanted to engage with. Like when I was a teenager, that's all I wanted. And it was really difficult to find. I mean, there was a lot out there, but I think it was just a lot harder to unearth in the darkest recesses of the internet.
I think for many of us, it was a shock when we found it existed.
Yeah, I mean,
it was a moment.
Yeah, I mean, I remember, I think really my first exposure to queerness in kind of like horror or horror adjacent was Willow from Buffy the Vampire Slayer.
Of course, yes.
Willow. And I think that to tie everything back sort of to Queer Saints is that Willow, when her girlfriend's name was Tara, right? Yeah. So when Tara died and Willow becomes Dark Willow, just so hot, like with like the black eyes and the veins and the dark hair. She's like wearing all black, and I remember like that was it for me. This like villain who was, I mean, she was hurt and traumatized, and she was flaying people alive, literally flaying people. Like I just remember that being like revelatory for me. And as a person who grew up and not the greatest of situations. Like, I'm pretty open about having grown up in poverty in Arkansas, with, you know, all the kinds of abuses and difficulties that are associated with poverty in rural areas. I think that seeing her kind of like, it was almost like an ascension. Like they wanted to, you know, she was the villain, but she was really like taking revenge and taking power back. And that was really powerful for me as a young queer person. I mean, I think I remember that when I was like 10 or 11, I was watching that before my stepmother banned me from watching Buffy and took the TV out of my room. But I remember that being like a really important part of my journey. And Queer Saints is, I mean, obviously it's a reaction to things that are going on now, but I think that it goes back to the heart of who I was as that little girl then, is that I wanted to see someone be nasty and horrible, and have that be powerful, because I'm not like that at all.
Oh, I totally get that, May. I totally get that identification with the queer villains, because like we're kind of set up for it, aren't we? Certainly people of our generation, we were set up with it. We were raised with queer coded villains all the way through our childhoods. Every Disney villain, and I mean every Disney villain from the late 80s through the 90s into the early 2000s, so incredibly queer coded, to the point where some of them are based on drag queens, some of them are based on actual queer people, you know?
And it had the best clothes.
Yeah.
Jewelry. They were the sexiest.
Absolutely.
They all had the best song.
They had the best songs. Absolutely. Absolutely. Best designs in the Disney films by a country mile.
Going back to the X-Men anime series with Magneto, which I still need to go back and like watch that entire show. But
speaking as a long-term X-Men fan, I anti-recommend that. Honestly, I really cannot. You really shouldn't. It doesn't hold up.
Keep the memories.
Davis is going to do it anyway.
It's really interesting. I mean, I revisited it recently when it was up on Disney Plus, and it evoked a lot of memories, and the stuff that it explores, given the context of the early 1990s, is really powerful. And there really was no other kids show that was exploring the stuff that it did. However, it's very 1990s, and it's problematic. I mean, the voice acting is by and large dreadful. I mean dreadful. Some of the animation is pretty clunky, depending on which studio is doing it, you know, at the time. I'd advise keeping the memory alive. But
it's coming back, and I'm here for it.
Yeah, it is coming back, isn't it? Interesting.
I'm sorry, Davis. We're talking over you.
No, it's okay. No. I was more of an X-Men Evolutions kid, anyways.
Right.
I really missed the character design for that. But what I was basically going on to say that like it's so fascinating to watch X-Men regain popularity in the past couple of years, and people attempt basically like queerness and mutants are so tied together in their narratives, and
there's no straight mutants.
No, especially now that Jean, Cyclops, and Wolverine are a confirmed throuple.
Really? That has happened?
Kind of. It's as close as the overlords in Disnopolis will allow them to confirm.
Right, okay.
They're all together.
Okay, now that is really interesting. I mean, there's also like a huge generational gap there as well. Wolverine's quite an old guy, right?
Okay, but I mean, they're not going to say it, but the O5 are 40 now. They're grown as adults.
Yeah, absolutely.
And also, he had in an alternate universe version of him, he had a relationship with Hercules,
which Marvel will never admit ever again. But it happened. It was on the page. They can't deny it.
Brilliance. Absolute brilliance.
So, like, And when it comes to queer representation in across all genres, but also in life, it's really interesting watching people. I've seen like this more happen more and more, where people are going like as often like in a very like humorous context, where like they're like, maybe I would have been in the Brotherhood.
Yeah.
and um it's really interesting because originally they were just cartoon villains. They're just evil bad guys. But as the comics have it began exploring uh being marginalized and being hunted down and oppressed and essentially being wanted to be wiped from existence, there's a lot more sympathy for that side and those characters who were doing like these very taking like very violent actions in order to save their own. And when you go to like the past, like it started up like 3 years ago, but the X-Men started their own country called Krakoa, and essentially it was Charles Xavier having to recognize that he was wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Never going to be able to save mutants by taking the route that he was taking. All the while, Magneto was having to pull back, and so there was like this really great discussion about like what is the best course about protecting your own, and also recognizing the fact that you're never going to be accepted by the people that hate you. They're always going to be seeing you as a threat. They are always going to, and to tie that back to queer literature and queerness in media, especially now that there are book bans all over the place, where it's just any kind of queer content.
Yeah.
It brings to note that like it's all the same.
Yeah.
No matter whether or not some queer reader believes it to be problematic representation or good representation, it is being banned all the same.
Yeah, I think that is really a really important thing to bring up, because I think we were doing podcast interviews last year for Queer Saints 1, and Haley Piper said something to the same effect, where she was like, it doesn't really matter if you write good queer characters or bad queer characters. They're like straight people who are against queerness are not going to accept it either way.
Absolutely.
So you might as well just write what you want to write.
Yeah.
And I think that another important aspect of the Queer Saints mission, quote unquote, is that these are books by queer people for queer people, and if you happen to pick it up and enjoy it and you're straight, I think that's great and I love it, but it's not for, it wasn't written for that audience.
Yep.
And this is really for a very specific audience. I mean, I think it's really important that people understand that Queer Saints isn't about anyone else but queer folks. And, like Davis was saying in relation to X-Men, it's like, how do you protect your own? How do you, for me, that's creating a book where I'm able to pay queer writers and give queer writers, especially queer horror writers who write more extreme horror, like give them opportunities to tell stories, and be on podcasts, and to like give people voices and platforms.
I think it's been an unambiguous success in that regard, mate. To be honest, it's certainly put me in touch with so many other queer creators in this genre and in others. It's been really wonderful in that regard. It's been a medium for creating community.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, some of the writers that I've come across, I mean, I think that Vivian we followed each other, and I've known Davis Davis was a part of the horror writers support group, which I ran like 2 years ago, I think. So I've known both of them kind of a little bit, but then some of the writers in the book are folks that I've never encountered before, and they just wrote something that really struck me. And now, you know, like as the book grows, the circle grows, and I think that we become stronger, and that's why I don't know how fond of it people are, but I like calling it the Queer Saints family, because I feel it sounds kind of cultish, but
I love it. I love it personally. I'm up for that. Queer Saints family. I like it. Because
I think the mission of the book really is community and like love and protection of the community of queer horror writers. Like that's how I feel about it.
No, it has been wonderful, and like I've introduced the book to a number of my straight friends as well, and by and large, the feedback is really, really positive. It's really positive, and I love that. I really love that.
I'm really looking forward to see how my straight friends react to it. I've got this nice circle of really supportive flat scans who love my writing and want to see me succeed, and I just can't wait to throw this at them.
Or did you read their stories?
I did. In fact, I read both of your stories this afternoon, which was great fun. That was an hour well spent, I can tell you. Loved it. Oh my God, Davis, your story, man. Wow, where did that come from?
I mean, obviously, it's written from Davis's own experience.
Obviously, clearly, is that
Yeah, I'm just missing a few body parts.
Clearly, wow.
Oh my God! Speaking of getting reaction from my straight friends, is
that what you want family members reading?
Oh no, I already told them. Like, by the way, I wrote I already told my parents. I said, look, if you read this, just know that I will be just sliding the book on the table and then immediately taking a flight out of the country.
Yeah. Don't read this while I'm present, and let it sit for a while, okay? Don't text me right away.
Yeah, and so with my friends, I was really excited. We were talking about my writing, and all of them were like, "Oh, well, we never read your stuff before," and I'm like,
"Oh, this is going to be the introduction."
Basically, and I've already had a couple friends read it, and I just got so many texts in the middle of the night, all caps, just "What are you doing, Davis?"
Wow.
Why are they reading this in the middle of the night? That's not a good thing to read before bed.
No, I had
depending on your taste, it could be a very good thing to read.
It's so great reading, having people who have never really experienced horror get introduced this way.
Yeah. Wow.
But especially since this is actually the first time that I've written something this extreme. Usually I tend to drift around a Neil Gaiman-esque fantasy horror kind of section. I wrote it as an experiment, mostly because I wanted to see what it would be like if I completely pulled back on the brakes and just saw what happened. And a lot of it was coming from, I'm really fascinated by, when I was in college, I went to a lot of gay bars, and a lot of what I was around was essentially just a very what's the best way to put this? I was around a lot of gay bars in college. And
guilty.
Yeah.
Yeah.
At that point, I got really fascinated by queer dynamics in gay bars and relationships between gay men, and how your own just what do you do for the affection of someone else,
Yeah.
and what are you capable of when you are just so willing to be loved by someone else, not to love someone, but to be loved.
Yeah.
And just what you are able, like, how do you fill up the empty spaces that were left behind after a life of missed opportunities and not being able to have what straight people had, and just clutching on to what you were able to clutch onto, like, like, you never had, like, I can still remember, like, the weird feeling of being able to, of what it was like to kiss a guy for the first time who had stubble.
Yeah.
And it's such a foreign experience to be able to feel that. And then you kind of just sit there and you go, like, oh, how much of the stuff that I am currently attempting to navigate is stuff that my friends were able to navigate in middle school, high school, and gain experience from, and just what, and then from there it was kind of just exploring more of those themes, and kind of just, I wanted to see what would happen with essentially the desperation to be someone else's and be loved and understand what it was like to have what you missed, and what happens when that was something that turns into a desire to have it at any cost.
Yeah, when it's all consuming, when you lose your identity in someone else and in the relationship. I think, I think that's where the principal identification is going to be for many gay male readers. It's because I think most of us have had that. Most of us have had that relationship, and it inevitably does go wrong, unfortunately, because it's just so, as you were saying, there is an immaturity to it, isn't there? There is, because we generally don't tend to have those experiences in high school or whatever. We don't know what we're doing. We don't really know what the consequences are going to be. So we go all in. We give ourselves completely to them, and it very rarely works out. But wow, yes.
Yes, and and that's the thing, is like, when I was going around gay bars as a freshly gay college student, like, it was having access to so much all at once, and the way that I like how people say, like, Americans can't drink because they have basically none of it until college, and then they go above and beyond and imbibe as much as possible. It was kind of that same situation where I found myself just attempting to have as many experiences as possible, just so that way I could experience.
Yeah, no, I totally get that. And Vivian, it's really for the best. I loved this story. I absolutely, I've got a penchant for transformations, and glorious transformations as well. The gloriously monstrous, love it to bits. And oh my God, when she emerges from the salon and she is this incredible creature, wow, I loved it. I loved that creature. I thought it was beautiful.
You guys listening to this can't see it, but I've basically just been wiggling in my seat for the past 30 seconds. I can't even look at the camera right now. I'm blushing so hard. Thank you very much. I'm glad it was. I was a little worried about it, but.
Well, what worried you?
I was going to say, no, it's beautiful. It's an absolutely beautiful story.
Part of it, as Davis said, this is a little different from what I've been writing. In May of this year, I did This Is Really for the Best. I did another couple of short stories trying to get into various other queer horror anthologies, and that was a break from the book series I've been writing, which has a very, very specific voice. It's still horror, but more horror adjacent. I've got a very prim and kind of prissy main character. There's it's not quite a joke, but she refuses to swear. And it's purely because as someone who has been told by supervisors that I swear too much, I think it's funny. Every time I write Amelia Temple, because she's narrating this in the first person, and then my girlfriend said something truly foul. You need to realize that I'm sitting at my keyboard giggling. That's the main, and then of course it sets up when she finally does swear. It's super, super dramatic. It's like, oh crap, she's really, really mad. So this was something different, something a little more extreme, and I was just kind of a little nervous getting out of my my previous wheelhouse. But I was really grateful because having spent so many years focused on that very specific voice, trying to be true to my main character, this really was very refreshing, very liberating.
Mhm.
Write something that was angrier.
Yeah.
As a trans woman, if there's one thing I feel very, very keenly, I'm not allowed to be angry
Hmm.
because anger is a male emotion. Obviously, that's not unique to me as a trans woman. Marginalized people of all sorts have our anger, our frustration, our negative feelings are policed
Yeah.
by the white supremacist patriarchy. As a trans woman specifically, it's policed in such a way to deny our existence. The moment, Wendy Carlos, when she was being pushed out of feminist groups in the 70s, the fact that she said she got frustrated to say this is bullshit was ammunition against her.
Yeah.
So that to get I'm so grateful for the Book of Queer Saints just to get that opportunity to write something that is, I think, it certainly was when I was writing it, very, very angry.
Hmm.
And just let that out in a way that obviously isn't, going back to, is this didactic? Am I saying every queer person should murder their abusive parents? Obviously not while I'm being recorded. No.
No, she would never.
I want my FBI
Disclaimer,
agent.
guys. Disclaimer.
Let my FBI agent know for the record. I did not say that. But yeah, just kind of delving into, as people point out, it's very Hellraiser. I was specifically going back to the Hellbound Heart. Now we all think of Pinhead as the spiky face of that franchise, but if you go back to the original novella, there is a character named the Engineer who kind of seems to be the one in charge of the Order of the Gash. So like I shamelessly stole that name. All apologies to Clive Barker.
It's a homage. It's a
You took
homage.
it and
It's
you made it your own.
I did. It's
Yeah,
punk rock.
absolutely.
It's punk rock. I kind of looked at, okay, if you look at how the original and the best Hellraiser media is, the Cenobites are all about extremes of sensation.
Mhm.
The recent remake with Jamie Clayton, going back to oh god, hot, it turns it to more about addiction.
Yeah.
And so then to really make it feel what I felt more transgender, I'm like, all right, this is about transformation. This really is just about what do you want? What will you give up to be that? Yeah, so sorry, I just lost my train of thought there, but
I must admit, when I was reading it, I lost myself in the idealized self that emerged.
Mhm.
I thought it was beautiful. The image I thought was just fantastic.
thank you. Yeah, that was
Okay,
so
that's my jam.
important.
It so is my jam. I gotta say.
There's I don't know if anyone else is familiar with Magic the Gathering. So there is this one. The whole setting is set into different. They call them planes, basically just different, magical worlds, each with their own rules. And one of the big one, and of course it's the villain one, is Phyrexia. And it's a similar motif. It's all about marrying metal to flesh, and those extreme transformations.
Very Barkerian, yeah.
Yeah, and uh, part of the inspiration was someone describing the different planes as a theme. It's like, and Phyrexia is the gender euphoria plane.
Fantastic.
So yeah, I've seen that before. It's kind of like you look at various, or at least I have various, feminized monsters. It's like, wow, why is this giving me gender euphoria? This is weird.
Mhm.
Let's just go with that. So how does this feel?
Yeah, no, I loved it. I thought it was a beautiful, beautiful story, and it's just great to see this variety in these collections. I mean, the same is true of the original Book of Queer Saints as well. There's some, I mean, I know a bit biased because I'm in it, but there's some stunners in there. There's some absolute stunners in there. I mean, you've got Mortar, and it just goes on. It just goes on. It's just stunning pieces of work.
All killer, no filler.
Yeah. I mean, it's again. I know we're in it, so we're in these collections. So, but yeah, they're very good. That's part of the joy of being in them, isn't it? I mean, I remember reading like my contributor copy of the original Book of Queer Saints and thinking, how the hell am I in this? This is insanely good. To be in this company is wonderful. It's wonderful, and it makes you feel like you're doing something halfway right.
Well,
There's
I think one of the things that sets apart the second one from the first one is that I was able to take on even more stories.
Mhm.
The first one has 13, and the second one has 19. And the amount of submissions I got for the second one was exactly double the first.
I can imagine, because it went far and wide, didn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
I can't believe the number of people who responded to the Book of Queer Saints. It was great.
Yeah, I think, I mean, the response, I think this is an important piece that I definitely want to put on the podcast, is that the response to the first one is the reason why the second one was able to happen, and why I was able to take on more stories, and why I was able to spend more money on cover art and spend more money on re-releasing the first one, so it could be this kind of, because the first one, when I put it out, that was the first book that I had ever done, and I had no idea what I was doing. And I had a couple of people kind of holding my hand through it, telling me like, okay, so now you need to do this, and you need to do this. Those people would be Sam Richard and Eric Ragland. They were instrumental in helping me get the book made, in terms of just telling me what I should, like, what I need to be looking at, and the software that I needed, and things like that. So
the nuts and bolts stuff, yeah.
So it was kind of like kind of like learning how to make a book. And now that I know how to make a book, I'm able to re-release it in a way where more of the ideal form. Like the first cover design, I know people tell me that they love it, but I threw that together myself. And the picture on the front is my best friend, who's a drag king in New York City. And it's just like a photo that they took to promote their art. And I was like, hey, could I use this photo? And I just took it and like made it black and white, and like put all these layers on it. And just threw it together, because the first cover artist was a friend of mine from college, and they never gave me the cover art. So I was like, I've got to put this together. So like seriously, I threw it together. I mean, so much work went into it. So many tears. I did everything myself.
So you had to learn to do that as well, yeah?
Yeah. But now that I know better how to do things, and I was able to afford cover art from like really wonderful artists. The featured cover art on the covers is by an artist called Ludo. They're under the named the Snake Bitch on Twitter. They're amazing. So they were able to give me these like really sort of demonic looking queer characters. There's like breasts and there's bush and like I'm so excited to have these on the cover of my book. But yeah, so like the response to the first one is the reason why I was able to take it further with the second one. More stories, more extreme, bigger word count, beautiful art. It's definitely become something bigger than it ever was supposed to be.
Definitely. Will there be a Book of Queer Saints 3?
That's what everybody was asking me when I made the first one, was if there would be a second one, and the answer is probably yes. There will be a third one, and it probably won't happen until 2025.
Fair enough. Will be worth the wait. Well, guys, thank you so much. This has been an absolute blast. Thank you for coming on. Before we go, is there anything that you guys would like to pimp out? Any projects that you're doing? Any publications? I mean, obviously, Book of Queer Saints 2, you know.
Let me hear what you guys are working on.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm always consistently working for Nightlight, which is a black horror podcast that can be found on any streaming platform, and I do all the sound design for half of the episodes, and I work with another talented sound designer, and we both help Tanya Ransom bring these stories to new listeners. And it's a great privilege to be a part of it. And they have like some really amazing stories. And I just like, we just released one that I really love. And it was so much fun doing all the sound design for that work.
Excellent. If you send me the links, Davis, I'll put them in the bar below.
Yeah, that sounds good. I'll do that.
Excellent. Vivian?
So, my big project, as I mentioned earlier, is the Amelia Temple series, a series of queer horror novels featuring a transgender eldritch horror and her new friends, set in the 1950s as they deal with both the various institutionalized bigotries of the world and also an ongoing conspiracy of wealthy mad science wizards.
That sounds great. That sounds great.
I'm very proud of it. Book 1, Beneath Strange Lights, is available now for order wherever books are sold. Book 2, Against Fearful Lies, will come out, we're planning March of 2024. And I am currently finishing up the first draft of Book 3. So,
excellent. Once again, send me the links. They will be placed in the content bar of the video. May?
Yeah, after Queer Saints wraps up, I am finishing my novel. It's called I'm Sorry If I Scared You. And then I already have books slated, other folks' books to publish via Medusa Publishing House. 2024 is completely booked. I think one of the books I'm most excited about is we're publishing a children's horror book by Jamie Flanagan.
Great.
It's going to be released next November. It's called The Gargoyle and the Mason. Yeah. And it's illustrated. It's beautiful. It's strangely gory. And I hope parents love it. Yeah, that's what I have going on. I mean, I have a lot of other projects on the slate, but I definitely recommend following Medusahaus on X, formerly Twitter,
and
Instagram to keep up with the projects. But yeah, we have a full slate, and it's going to be really exciting.
Excellent. Once again, guys, links below. As for myself, you can find me knocking about here on the Exaggerated Elegy channel, where there are various podcasts like this, video game let's plays, and all sorts of stuff going on. Links to all of my published work are over at strangeplaygrounds.com. And most recently, if you pop on over to Arrow Films, you will find a new Hellraiser Blu-ray set, an anniversary set, which myself and my compatriot Kit Power feature on. We were on the Hellbound disc on the featurette Hell is What They Wanted. Well, guys, once again, thank you. That was fantastic. Thank you so, so much.
Thank you.
And I look forward to having you. I hope you'll all come on again at some point, yeah?
Oh, of course.
Brilliance.
Absolutely.
Brilliance. Bye-bye, guys.
All right. Bye.
That was
Bye.
awesome.